nosotros estamos propiciando en este día. Debo decirles que nuestra presentación en este día va a ser en inglés y nos preparamos ya para no tener traducción. Esto va a ser todo lo que vamos a decir en español y vamos a hacer el switch para el inglés y así vamos a tener toda nuestra presentación durante este día. La presentación conlleva tres partes, una introducción breve con una oración. Inmediatamente luego vamos a presentar a la persona que va a exponer. Una vez va a exponer sin ninguna interrupción y al final vamos a tener una sección donde podremos interactuar con el orador. Comenzamos con preguntas. Era el final, pero vamos. Muy bien, vamos a orar para iniciar nuestro programa en este momento. Gracias, nuestro Dios, por tu amor y bendición. Gracias por todo lo que tú haces por nosotros. En este momento te rogamos que nos acompañes, nos dirijas al estudiar y aprender de tu palabra, de las cosas que tenemos que desarrollar. Y gracias por que tenemos la oportunidad de tener líderes académicos como el Dr. Miller que nos pueden guiar y nos pueden orientar en muchas cosas importantes. En el nombre de Jesús, amén. So from now on, we will go in English without any translation. For those who are watching in the social media, be ready for now continue in English. I will introduce to you now our president, the president of the seminary, Dr. Efraín Velázquez, who will do the presentation of the person who will be in charge of the instruction today.
Thank you, Dr. Guzman. He's the Vice President for Academic Affairs for the Inter-American Theological Seminary, and we're glad to have all of you here. As you perhaps have seen already in social media, we had a lecture on the issue of immigration. We had that a couple of days ago, and it has been translated into Spanish. Through AI, Dr. Miller, you speak Spanish very fluently.
The gift of tongue.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. The problem with AI is that sometimes the faces they don't match with the speaking, but that will be solved, and we want to maximize the time. That's why we'll ask your indulgence this morning for those who don't speak English or understand English, but you will have it in English very soon, coming soon. And in this time, we're going to introduce Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller, he studied theology at PUC several months ago. And then he studied also law, and he exercised his gift in the courthouse in New York City and the East Coast, and then in the Midwest. After finishing his studies further studies in the area of church history and relationships with church and state, at the request of Andrews University, he served there also in an institute that was focused on precisely religious liberty and these issues that we are so concerned. In his practice of law, he has been able to help not only the Adventist Church, but every other communities that are interested in issues of religious liberty. And it has been a real blessing to have him, not only there, but now at Washington University, next to the General Conference and that area of the East Coast, where he's also co-directing that Center of Law and Public Policy. Now, as a research fellow from Andrews and a full professor of that university, he's leading the way in issues that he's consulted, like the issues of the relationship between schools and some of the laws that have been imposed or they have been trying to impose on higher education, and precisely in those issues that are concerning many. He's going to develop it in the first part of the presentation. So he's going to take the first part as a presentation, and then we'll have the Q&A. Then you will have the opportunity to interact with us. We're going to perhaps give you a phone number so you can text those to me, and then we'll able to give them to them and do it in the same way as our friends, either through social media or Zoom or YouTube. You can also make your questions and we'll try to answer them. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Miller, for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Which microphone should I use? Oh, use both. I see. Good. Yeah, I feel special with two microphones. So thank you for having me here today. It's always good to be at Antillean University, especially in January and February, where the weather is a bit different in the upper United States. It's a blessing to be here now and to have been here in the past and gotten to know at least several of you here. And I hold this university in high regard as being an important connection, an important bridge between Inter-America, the Latin American part of the world, and the North America, the United States. Different cultures in many ways, different churches, and yet it's important that we all get along as one big church. And I think that the seminary here and the university here is an important part of keeping us together. And that's why in part, I've been willing to and wanting to come down here and understand what happens here and let my colleagues back in America know more about Latin America and South America. And my scholarship has been impacted, the things I write on, I'm hoping with a greater sensitivity to the challenges faced here in Central and Latin America. So having said that, the topic today is one that has commanded a fair amount of interest over the last few years. The cover slide here is from the Conference on Biblical Human Sexuality, where I gave this presentation at the request of the General Conference to the Inter-European Division just a few months ago. So this topic is being talked about everywhere. One of the challenges is there's rather dramatic changes in the legal framework of that topic. In fact, I was almost wondering whether we should focus perhaps on something else, because the new president of the United States has now informed us and decreed that, in fact, there are only two genders. And I'm not sure if this is in a footnote or not, but there's only two sexual orientations as well. If you're a man, it's towards women and vice versa. So I'm saying that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but he really did release an order that the U.S. government will consider there are only two genders. And certainly the pressures that we have experienced for the last few years as academic institutions, as schools, as other institutions. Do I need to be closer to the microphone? Or there's some, am I all right on the sound levels? Okay. We were facing real difficulties, and as was referenced by my brother Ephraim, I was helping legally defend a group of Christian colleges. The Council on Christian Colleges and Universities is the largest collection of evangelical colleges in the world, more than about 180 colleges. And we were involved in litigation in federal court, defending the right of Christian colleges to uphold biblical principles of sexuality and gender against the attack of certain LGBT groups. We were successful in our defense of what's known as the Title IX Religious Universities exemption. Here in Puerto Rico, you are subject to that because you're part of you're an American territory. And it's what allows students at our universities to have federal loans and grants to support their education, but also allow those universities to uphold biblical vision of gender and sexuality. So we were fighting for this. Now suddenly we are in a new era where it looks like all the new laws are on our side, and this won't be such a big deal. But this could shift again, couldn't it? And here we are in Latin America, where sometimes you have very conservative governments, but sometimes you have very socialist left-wing governments. And a lot of countries in South America got gay marriage before the United States did. So the reality is that we are going to be dealing with these issues moving forward, whether or not Donald Trump is president. And even in the United States, depending if you're on a liberal state, you can still face challenges on this front. So it's an issue continuing of continuing value and importance in the church, not just as a political question, and in fact, maybe primarily not as a political question, but as a theological and social question, because we're always going to be confronted with the challenge to our traditional understanding and reading of the Bible. And so, some have suggested that gender and sexuality are somewhat like race. There was a period of time when the Christian church, at least in the West and the United States, did not do well on the question of race. And there were at least certain Christians that used biblical teachings about the mark of Cain or the curse of Ham, or texts about slavery seeming to support slavery, that suggested that a discriminatory society was the best kind of society. And in fact, that didn't just end in the 19th century, but South Africa had a formal system of apartheid based at least in part on certain religious perspectives and teachings from the Bible. Early Adventism was quite egalitarian in its outlook on race. Ellen White emphasized that all were created in the image of God. But after her death, the church was influenced by fundamentalism, which was a little bit more open to racial discrimination. And unfortunately, some of our institutions in the United States bought into that discrimination. And it was only in the 1960s and 70s that we moved away, and various institutions have repented and asked for forgiveness for engaging in this kind of discrimination. And some onlookers wonder if the same thing could happen in terms of sexuality and gender. Is it that we were just captured by a particular conservative and medieval view of gender and sexuality, and we need to move along with the times, and as science unfolds, like on issues of race, we can move into more liberal views on issues of sexuality and gender? So that's a question that interests me, both as a thought leader in the church and as a church historian. And it's true that some groups have shifted on race and segregation. A famous one is the Mormons believed that only whites could go to the highest level of heaven, but then their prophet had a vision in the 1970s that changed that, and now apparently everyone can get there, which is a relief for us Gentiles, right? But is it really fair to compare these two topics? And in the telling of my story, I hope you can see some differences already. The issue of conservative Christians engaging in discrimination on the basis of race is a fairly recent, historically rooted phenomenon that really arises. You can read the history of the rise of racism in the West that had to do with slavery in the 15th and 16th centuries, originating with Portugal, starting the slave trade. But sadly enough, I was born in England, the British Empire taking it to new heights. And the original justification of slavery actually had to do with religion and not race. The Pope gave a decree that the Portuguese and the Spanish could go and conquer non-Christian lands and subjugate them and bring them into the church. But if they refused to come into the church, one of the options was to make them slaves. And so it wasn't the fact that they were of a different race, it was that they were of a different religion. Now, Christianity wasn't the only group that did this. The Muslim world also engaged in this way. In fact, really, there were white slaves before there were black slaves. For a long period of time in the Middle of Ages, the main form of slavery were Muslims capturing Europeans and keeping them as slaves. But if you converted to Islam, they could no longer hold you. A similar thing happened in the Christian West. The African slaves that were brought were not initially Christian, therefore there was justification. It was thought in the minds of some as holding them as slaves. But as the missionaries began to missionize, the owners were resistant to it because they felt they would lose their slaves. And so Christian theologians, it may be that they want me to put on a more effective microphone. Okay. Is that helpful to our sound people? Okay. So the idea of slavery, of race being the basis of discrimination is something that emerges in the 16th and 17th centuries. And even as it emerged, it also found opponents in the Christian world. So you may be familiar with the name Bartholomew de las Casas, who wrote strenuously against the misuse of native peoples on the basis of race or religion in the New World. Groups like the Quakers were early on critics of slavery. There were always Christian voices against this practice, even when they were in the minority. And it was eventually those Christian voices that overcame the commercial interests that supported the slave trade. And of course, the story found in the movie Amazing Grace, and William Wilberforce tells that story well. And so this is a very different story than the story of sexuality and gender in Christian history, because there has been a much greater rootedness in central Christian theological concepts and a much greater consistency over time, right? You can't look at the 2,000 years of Christian history and say, oh yes, in the early church or in the Middle Ages, gender variability and homosexual behavior was embraced as a good, right? It never was. You can only find it being accepted by Christians in the mid to late 20th century and really the beginnings of the 21st century, but based on very different and modernist and liberal theological assumptions that don't take the Bible seriously, right? So I hope you can see, so there's two differences right up front: the rootedness in Christian doctrine and the consistency throughout history, right? You have a plain, consistent Christian teaching on sexuality and gender for 1900 years, and then you begin to have deviations. On race, you have a pretty consistent teaching of equality in Christ for 15 or 1600 years, which then begins to become perverted through commercial and imperial interests and is used by some Christians, but always spoken against by others, right? These are two very different stories from a historical perspective. One of the important points to see is, and this is resorting to philosophical understandings. Too much is often made that somehow our discovery of alternate sexualities and genders is a modern conception that ancients had no knowledge of. But Christian historians and other historians have shown that the Greco-Roman world was very familiar with the idea of men who feminized themselves, who were in effect transgender and presented themselves as women. And throughout the Hebrew scriptures, we see a knowledge of course, homosexual practices. And if you read the Greek philosophers, there's an awareness of people, of men who have a fixed orientation in the opposite direction from the norm. A helpful philosophical concept to understand the difference between race and gender is to think of it in terms of essence and accidents. And, this is getting a little bit into some Greek philosophy, but the Greeks were right about some things, and I think this is one of them, because if you go back to the Bible, how many races were there in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were created? There was one race, it was the human race. Now, it contained perhaps all the genetic diversity that could express itself in all the races that we see today. But they would have been puzzled if you'd asked them, what race are you? When there's only one race, there's no concept of race. But in the Garden of Eden, how many genders were there? And right from the very beginning, humanity had two genders. And furthermore, you couldn't have a human race without the two genders, because it would have ended in one generation. So gender is fundamental to the identity of the human being, to the essence of the human being. And of course, we need to say very quickly that not one gender is more essential than the other. They both are necessary, and they both form together the fuller image of God than either of them separately. Now, this seems a little bit of a rarefied concept, but I think it's an important one, because we can see that race develops and changes over time as people groups move and morph, and really there are no hard edges to any race. If you ask biologists and ethnologists, there really is one human race with multiple variations in it. Whereas gender, male and female, has remained a vitally important construct in human history because of the necessity of procreation, and then the raising of children, and the protecting and allowing the different genders to play the roles that they are obviously more biologically gifted for in raising and rearing children, right? So far, transgender claims aside, no man has ever breastfed a child. So there just are fundamental biological realities that even if you don't believe in creation and the Genesis story, you still have to take seriously. Even evolutionists believe there was an Eve figure out of all the human race originated, and that clearly the male and the female is necessary to the continuation of the species. And in our law is reflected this fact that race and gender are different. Race is protected at the highest category in the American Constitution, right? Occasionally you can discriminate on race, but only on grounds that are deeply demonstrable, and the importance is very high. So there may be certain races that are prone to medical conditions of one kind or another. So you're allowed to focus medical testing on those groups, right? But for the most part, if you try to discriminate on race, it will be knocked down as invidious discrimination. Gender, on the other hand, is viewed as a middle category in the law that receives significant but not the highest level of protection. And that is why when you go around in public places, you never find restrooms for blacks and whites, at least since the 1960s, but you will find restrooms for men and women, right? Because the law recognizes there are some fundamental and important differences that need to be preserved, protected, and made distinct. So as Christians, we're not arguing such a crazy position, because the law itself already recognizes that gender and race are somewhat different in important ways that make a difference in how we think about them. Now, I'm going to move very rapidly through a few slides about the history of the last few thousand years. I've already talked about the Old Testament backgrounds, this distinctions of gender in creation, and the distinctions are reflected in continued importance about, you can see this in the logic of the whole person, that human beings are a psychosomatic unity of mind, body, and spirit. And now we're getting into the question of gender here, less so than sexual orientation. But if you think about it, the claims of the transgender community are effectively that your physical body is different than the identity contained in some kind of essential spirit of who you are. And this is a very dualistic outlook that would suggest that your body is merely a container for something that is essentially you. Well, for Adventists, we believe that you can't separate those out, that the soul is not independent of the body, but there's a psychosomatic unity of the whole. And more evangelical Christians are beginning to see the importance of this point. This is opening a door. I've given some lectures to Christian groups that, this isn't just about eternal hell and hellfire, this notion that dualism has problems, but it goes to our ability to deal with issues of gender and sexuality. And more evangelicals are becoming more favorable to a holistic view of the human being because they see the concern of the separating out of a gender identity from a physical identity. Of course, the Bible also, we see in the expressions, the Bible talks about cross-dressing, right? Men shan't wear women's clothing and vice versa in the book of Leviticus. And that can seem perhaps an isolated ritualistic concern about temple prostitutes or something. But when you see it as part of the background of the Bible's concern for this larger gender question, it becomes another evidence or symptom of the concern that God has for the realization and expression and the importance of both genders being expressed, right? Because if we don't acknowledge that and we muddle the genders, then we don't get a full expression of either gender and therefore not a full expression of the image of God. The Bible recognizes that the mind is fallen, that all parts of the human are corrupted by sin, and that we have to have guidance from God as to determining what is in our best interests. And here's the three things that I like to point out in the Old Testament, recognizing the importance of gender distinctiveness. The cross-dressing text, of course, same-sex sexual behavior is forbidden, and in some ways that's a separate category, but it also shows a concern with gender distinctiveness. Because if you could just switch genders through choice, then you could engage in same-sex sexual behavior by just claiming you were of the opposite sex. And then the prohibition against genital mutilation is a suggestion that these parts of our identity are important. Dr. Dick Davidson from the seminary has pointed out that these cross-dressing concerns go beyond the cultural concerns of the day, but has to do with the basic distinctions of the gender duality set out in the Bible. Christ, of course, speaks directly to the male and female. God made them male and female, and reaffirms a monogamous heterosexual marriage in his teaching. The Bible also refers to eunuchs, as does Christ. And I think here we have an important aside. Some people want to suggest that eunuchs are a third sex of some kind, but eunuchs in the Bible are never referred to as an alternate sex or a third sex. Whether it be the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, he baptized him, right? Where he's still designated as a male, even if there may be sexual non-function or dysfunction. And Christ's references in this regard, some are born eunuchs, some are made eunuchs, and some become eunuchs for the kingdom of God, should alert us to the fact that it is not a basic human right that all people will lead a healthy, productive sexual life. There are some people who are eunuchs by birth, by events that happen in their life, and perhaps choices for the kingdom of God, which some people make who either are asexual or perhaps homosexual, but realize that's not the best fulfillment for their life and expression. So we need to jump. I want to leave room for questions. And so we have to jump to our present era. All of this was really understood more or less. Unfortunately, the church entered into a period of time when the feminine sex was suppressed. The Middle Ages were a great era of patriarchy, even reflected in the name of religious leaders, right? What did you call where does the word pope come from? It's papa. The priests are referred to as fathers. There was no equivalent female roles in the church. Yes, there were religious orders, but they would be nuns keeping to themselves in nunneries or monasteries. And it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation came. In fact, marriage itself was viewed as a lesser good, or maybe even a lesser evil. And the best, the most spiritual, stayed celibate. And of course, this was in part because of the contamination that women would bring, allegedly. Wasn't helped by Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, who viewed women as inferior men who just hadn't developed adequately.
Mercy.
So both Martin Luther and Calvin, quite scandalously at the time, marry, right? Martin Luther marries a former nun. So you have a former monk marrying a former nun. And it scandalized Europe. But Luther thought it was so important to recognize the goodness of marriage and a kind of essential equality of gender that he undertook that step, despite it being used by his enemies to criticize him. We roll forward a few hundred years and we come to a time where philosophy has again delinked the physical from the moral and the spiritual. A post-Freudian, materialist, postmodern 20th century, the subjective sense of self becomes the most important measure of values, of identity, of meaning in life. And therefore, if I'm in a male body, but I really feel like something else, a woman, or some other gender, or some mixture of the two, I should be allowed to choose that as my identity, as opposed to the actual physical material world that we're a part of. This is what we lose in part when we lose a concept of the natural law, of there being signs in nature about how God created things and intends them to be. So this has brought us human autonomy to define one's identity and the place in the world has become the core freedom for many. And any sense that we can look at nature and see objective guidance to who we are and how we should act is largely set aside. And I have to say that Adventism has fallen into this trap a bit. And I'll just speak briefly to that for a moment. In both the liberal and the conservative side, on the conservative side, it's easier to see our temptation has been a fundamentalism which places entire emphasis on the Bible. We believe in sola scriptura, but some people treat it as solo scriptura and say this is only where spiritual and moral truths come from, and nature is too confusing and can't be dealt with and needs to be left aside. The problem is, when you're dealing with public policy and issues of society, you can't just continuously invoke the Bible. You have to invoke other sources of moral truth. And historically, for Protestants, that has been the world of nature and the observation of humanity and sort of a quasi-Greek philosophy. But the Bible itself talks about the value of natural law and what nature can teach us. And so too many conservative Adventists believe what the Bible teaches about gender and sexuality, but they have no way of expressing it in a manner that connects with the modern world, with society around them, and at times with their own children. The progressives have gone in a different direction and have kind of embraced a neo-orthodoxy that also focuses on the Bible, a little more symbolically, but also not interested in what the natural law has to say. And therefore follows down a pathway of kind of liberal acceptance, often of LGBT issues. Ellen White, in one of her more famous statements, in my mind, said there are three things we especially need to study in our schools: moral philosophy, the Bible, and physical education. Everyone knows what the Bible is, and we're supposed to study that. Most people know what physical education is, but many Adventists have no idea about moral philosophy. And they think, oh, she means morality as taught in the Bible. But she doesn't. Moral philosophy was a term of art that meant morality studied from sources in the natural world, as opposed to biblical revelation. And not that the two are opposed to each other, but they are necessary complements to one another. And if we want to effectively teach biblical sexuality and gender to our family, to our community, and to larger society, we have to engage both books of nature. And I think you would all agree this is becoming of greater importance, because the LGBT community isn't out there like they're strangers banging on our walls. They are part of us. Given statistics, probably somebody, maybe more than one in this room, struggles with these issues. Certainly we have people in this room who have relatives, close loved ones, whether it be brothers or sons or daughters, that wrestle with these things. This is about people, and people deserve our best compassion, careful thought and attention, and not just slogans or a few clear texts from the Bible to get them to change our minds. And so this is a call not just for clarity of biblical thought or even clarity of Christian thought, but also clarity of pastoral thought and heart in engaging with this topic in biblically faithful but compassionate and constructive ways. So I think I'll end my formal presentation there, and we can have some questions.
Yes. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for all those who are connected. We're going to finish the chapter, but we're going to keep on here. But the chapter that is going to be in our YouTube channel. Thank you for those who are subscribers of the YouTube channel of the Inter-American Adventist Theological Seminary. But this Q&A, we're going to do it bilingually, in Spanish and English. So that's why, if you are interested in more of it, you can write us afterwards. So now, perhaps, Doctor, you can translate him in his next to him, so I can go ahead. And so I will keep on in Spanish. Okay. Bueno, mi gente, esto ha sido un banquete. Y lo cierto es que había que darle el espacio, el tiempo. Si hubiésemos traducido, se puede imaginar, es el doble del tiempo. Lo que le impide que él, de hecho, como ustedes ven las diapositivas, él se quedó corto. Si nosotros hubiésemos incluido la traducción, no lo hubiésemos logrado. Lamento que no pudimos, tal vez a través del Zoom, haber hecho algo para los headphones o algo por el estilo, que ya lo he apuntado para futuras ocasiones. Queremos que todos estén incluidos. Pero este es el momento de preguntas y respuestas. Yo tengo mi listita de preguntas y respuestas, pero quiero permitir que la audiencia lo haga. Nosotros sabemos que ustedes pueden dar excelentes discursos, pero en esta ocasión no estamos interesados en su pregunta. Una reacción breve puede estar apropiada, pero lo más importante es su pregunta. Si tienen una clarificación, lo voy a hacer. Ya sea por texto o en este caso, como hemos separado este tiempo, lo podemos hacer también de manera audible. Ok, perfecto, muy bien. Voy a verificarla acá. La pregunta la voy a hacer en inglés. Bueno, yo la voy a decir en español. Tú la puedes leer. Dice, ¿cuáles son las protecciones que hay bajo la ley norteamericana en casos que aplican a un pastor quien no quiere casar a una pareja del mismo sexo?
It's a good question. There is significant constitutional and legal protection for pastors to marry who they believe they should and not marry those who they think they shouldn't.
Muy bien, así que tenemos mucha protección legal para los pastores, para casar solamente a aquellas personas que ellos consideren que deberían estar juntos. Así que no debe haber ese temor. Hay las protecciones legales y constitucionales. Muy bien. Otra pregunta.
I'll just add to that. Really, the only places in the world where this is an issue is in countries, maybe in Europe, maybe in South America, where there is a state church. state-funded church, and same-sex marriage is legal, and those pastors may, and in some instances have been found to have obligations to marry, but if you're not a state church pastor, there will never be an issue, at least in the United States and in most other places.
Excepto en algunos países donde, ya sea Sudamérica o Europa, hay una iglesia que es del Estado y en estos casos son funded, son pagadas por el Estado. Usted paga sus impuestos, va a la iglesia. Y en ese caso, si usted es un pastor de esa iglesia del Estado, entonces es que pudiese estar obligado a hacerlo porque es parte de sus funciones. Sí, if they have approved the same-sex marriage in that country. Muy bien, excelente pregunta. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Yo voy a ir, then I will go on. If they don't have, I have. I don't want to go through the rabbit hole of the Black legend on the Spanish and Bartolomé de las Casas, but that's between the British and the Spanish. No, sí, Dios lo puede traer para hacerlo rápido. Sí, sí, yo no voy a perderme en el debate que podemos tener aquí acerca de la leyenda negra sobre los británicos y los españoles, pero but we have very, very important questions that we should perhaps develop. Tenemos otras preguntas que podemos desarrollar. For example, you spoke about the natural law and how today the Court of Freedom has switched the center of gravity, perhaps. Can you elaborate more on the core freedom that people, especially in postmodernism, they see as the most important value? Le estoy preguntando acerca de esa esencia o libertad medular que muchas veces se está argumentando que hoy por hoy la sociedad está empujando.
Yes, so that's a good question. For the modern, postmodern person, the self is the one that defines reality, that defines value. You know, postmodernism is in part a rejection of larger narratives and overarching principles. So what the self decides, it's a secular existentialism where you create your own values and your own reality. And Catholics, of course, like to blame this on Protestants. Martin Luther and the priesthood of believers and the creation of the individual at the expense of the church and the community. Oh, shall I let you translate
yes,
that?
Yes, and this is post-Freudian, you know, you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Él está mencionando que nosotros vemos en la actualidad, especialmente en el posmodernismo y demás, un énfasis en el yo. O sea, que la libertad máxima se trata de yo autorrealizarme. Los católicos argumentan que esto es culpa de los protestantes, por Martín Lutero y los otros reformadores que enfatizaban la libertad del individuo sobre la comunidad. Y cómo ese centro de gravedad ha cambiado, y esa es la explicación que muchos están dando.
So, I think the Catholics overlook an important point. And that is, the modern era has come out not from one enlightenment, but from several different versions of the Enlightenment.
Los católicos no están claros porque el iluminismo no vino solamente desde los orígenes de la Reforma, sino que son varias, la ilustración tiene varias fuentes para el producto que tenemos nosotros en la actualidad.
And the version of the Enlightenment that came out of Protestantism actually had significant community values within it.
Y el iluminismo que sale, o la ilustración del protestantismo, tiene elementos comunales en sí mismo.
So even Martin Luther's priesthood of all believers was a priesthood, a gathering of priests of all believers, not a collection of popes, right?
Él argumenta que Lutero, cuando defiende el sacerdocio de todos los creyentes, es precisamente un grupo de sacerdotes. Son todos los que son sacerdotes y no un grupo de papas.
So individuals should read the scripture for themselves, but doctrine and teaching should be formulated among the community of believers rather than being given from a pope or a few cardinals. But there was the individual and the community important together.
Entonces, cuando desarrollamos o articulamos doctrina, no lo hacemos una persona aislada, sino que se hace en comunidad. Tampoco es un papa que le impone, sino que se hace entre creyentes y para beneficio de los creyentes.
There were more extreme versions of the Enlightenment that were more critical of communities, especially religious communities, and emphasized the individual more. But those versions of the Enlightenment came from Catholics, from countries that had been predominantly Catholic, like France, right?
Ujú.
The Enlightenment in France is very skeptical and extreme.
Entonces, el iluminismo, la ilustración, en algunos países como Francia, que son países bien católicos, son aquellos que eran más agresivos para el tema de la comunidad y que sospechaban de la comunidad. Y son individualistas extremos, como lo vemos aún en la sociedad francesa de la actualidad.
So the oppression in Catholic countries led to a backlash and overreaction with a more corrosive kind of secularism that was more highly individualistic.
Entonces, tenemos que en esos países donde la Iglesia Católica fue más extrema, hay un movimiento pendular al otro extremo, donde el individualismo es más corrosivo, la secularización es más corrosiva, nos lleva a un individualismo que es tóxico.
And rather than the thought of John Locke, which was both individualistic and community in balance underneath God, it was John Mill, 100 and something years later in the middle 19th century, who really focuses on the autonomous individual.
Entonces, ustedes ven la diferencia con John Locke, quien tenía el individualismo un poco similar al que tenía, pero le expliqué el francés, pero enfatizaba también en un balance, pero llega hasta John Mill, es 100 años más tarde, que entonces venimos a caer en tiempo y tener una postura realmente más balanceada.
So John Locke embraces the natural law and natural rights.
John Locke es el que es bajo Dios y abraza la ley natural bajo Dios.
And his philosophy is really the philosophy of the American Protestant founding.
Y es la filosofía americana de los fundadores norteamericanos.
But John Mill, who's more impacted by the skeptical enlightenment.
Entonces John Mill es el que es impactado por los escépticos. Entonces se va para otro lado.
He's a utilitarian and not a religious thinker.
Él es utilitarista y no es un pensador religioso.
And he becomes the philosopher of 20th century American secularism.
Y él es el que se convierte en el filósofo del secularismo del siglo XX.
That is excessively individualistic, subjective in its definition of self.
Que es excesivamente individualista y subjetivo de lo que es el yo. So you go to an area that I had a question, and perhaps we have yo lo voy a decir en español. You can keep it in English. Algo que yo tenía una pregunta que yo no había leído sobre el énfasis de la señora White en el estudio de la filosofía moral. Esto para la música, para los oídos, para el doctor Eric del Valle, que ya ilumina cuando escuche ese tipo de comentarios, porque nos hace falta, sin lugar a dudas, nosotros en los departamentos de teología, ya sea a nivel de bachillerato y también nosotros en el seminario, abordar un poco más. Yo sé que Obed también le gusta leer y estudiar en el área de filosofía. Yo creo que nosotros deberíamos abordar más estos temas y más aún sabiendo que la señora White también está enfatizando en el estudio de la filosofía moral. ¿Qué usted cree, cómo nosotros podemos exponer mejor a los estudiantes a filosofía moral?
Yes, we have to become more knowledgeable and aware of the value of this other Christian Protestant tradition that supplements and complements biblical teachings on morality.
Debemos estar más conscientes y estudiar la filosofía que compete a las enseñanzas del cristianismo.
Ellen White says the preaching of the third angel's message must be accompanied by a declaration of the natural law.
Wow. La señora White dice que el mensaje del tercer ángel debe estar acompañado de la proclamación de la vigencia de la ley natural.
And these, I don't have the site off the top of my head, but it's not hard to find. Just plug in natural law into Ellen White's writings, and you will discover that she said a fair bit about it.
Ustedes solamente busquen en el motor de búsqueda de base de datos la palabra ley natural, así, con las comillas, ley natural, para ver todas las veces que ella habla acerca de ley natural, bastante más de lo que nosotros imaginamos.
Basically, in the 20th century, we've reduced what she says about natural law to physical health.
En el siglo XX nosotros lo redujimos solamente como si se tratara de ley de salud, temas de salud.
And we've
Física.
we've created a kind of dualism of our own, right? Keeping our bodies healthy, and then just worrying about spiritual things. But for her, the natural law included physical health, but also emotional, social, psychological, and spiritual.
Nosotros hemos hecho un dualismo vegetal en el cual separamos los dos. Sin embargo, cuando ella habla acerca de la ley natural, incluye la parte mental, la parte física, es de manera integral y sociológica.
See, that's why our psychology department is also a department of theology in a sense. It's natural theology of how God made us and how we think.
Por eso nuestros departamentos de psicología también son departamentos de teología, porque nos hablan acerca de la ley natural. Doctor, you had a question?
I wanted to know if we have scholars in our church that speak about the natural laws and the natural whatever philosophy. Because I mean, why do I have to go to a secular person?
Just a second, hold on, doctor. She's Dr. Colon, our emeritus president of Antillean University. We want to listen to her. Sorry.
I wanted to know if we have Seventh-day Adventist scholars that have studied this aspect of natural philosophy so that they could give us some light on this.
Ella está hablando acerca de si tenemos otros eruditos que han estado haciendo estudios en esta área.
Unfortunately, very few, partially because of our kind of engagement with fundamentalism in the 20th century. We decided that really the only really important studies are biblical studies, and theology must arise from the Bible. And so there's just a few of us who've taken seriously what Ellen White says in this regard. And there are some other political science thinkers at Andrews, some people in the seminary who realize the importance of this in the theology department, but I can't exactly point you. Martin Hanna is in the theology department and wrote a book about the revelation of Christ in nature. Ante Jarancic does some thinking about this, but I've been something of a one-man crusade, and probably because of my experience in the legal world, where I realize how naked we are if we are only bringing the Bible in. I'm like, oh, we have to understand and get back to this natural law reasoning. Other evangelicals have come to realize the importance of this, and you can find other Christian authors. Sorry.
So, así que tenemos que son pocos los adventistas que lo han hecho. ¿Por qué? Porque la mayoría han sido biblistas. Esos biblistas como Guzmán y como Velázquez. Bibles. Pero tenemos, casi se ha convertido en una cruzada de una sola persona porque él está interesado en el tema. Para el doctor Hanna que es original de Jamaica, por cierto, y han sido bien pocos los que han estado abordando este tema. La pasión que él tiene es no solamente enfatizar lo que nos contribuye a la Biblia, sino también lo que la filosofía nos puede contribuir y la ley natural. Por cierto, ya que necesitamos el micrófono para escuchar la pregunta, me pueden textear al 787-224-2345. Voy a tomar en orden los que ya me escribieron. 787-224-2345. I was just giving them my number
Sure,
here.
yeah.
So the next question is, y tú la traduces en español, en inglés, por favor. Elena de White señala que el conocimiento de las leyes del desarrollo físico son importantes. Leyes de la herencia y el desarrollo mental. ¿Qué efecto tiene eso al trabajar con la comunidad LGTB?
This knowledge have to for working with the
LGBT.
LGBT community.
A knowledge of natural law for understanding the LGBT community.
Yes, the laws of heritage.
Puede añadirle en la situación de un niño ser abusado
For
a
example, when
temprana
a
edad
child is
o niños que
abused,
vienen de hogares maltratados, el
children that
conocimiento
are
de
coming
todas estas
from
leyes físicas,
difficult
el desarrollo de la herencia, cómo la
circumstances,
iglesia
how
entonces se acerca a la
know
comunidad
this,
LGBT o se acerca a estas personas
taking this
que
on
toman
account,
orientaciones.
how
Tomamos
that
en
helps
cuenta eso,
for the church to
analizamos eso para
approach
trabajar con estas personas.
the
¿Cómo está trabajando
difficulties.
Yo le voy a
of these
añadir algo
people.
también, me gustó. So he's asking how other issues like abuse, even gender dysphoria,
Mhm.
elements that are part of heritage,
Mhm.
that somebody that has, for example, gender dysphoria, that doesn't mean that they have to act upon, you know, these tendencies that we have. We have people with tendencies to alcohol, to
Stealing.
stealing, you know, stealing. So how we help the community, and how the church is trying to help the community, or just ignoring these facts from natural law.
No, that's a very good question, and these are questions of practical ministry. And if there's one author I want to mention other than Ellen White, it's Mark Yarhouse, Yarhouse, who has written a number of books on both homosexuality and transgender that help us better understand it. Maybe you want to.
Sí, yes. Estas preguntas son bien importantes. Gracias, Pastor, por estas preguntas. Son pastorales y son aplicables. Él está recomendando a el doctor Yarhouse. Yarhouse, él estuvo en Wheaton, la Universidad de Wheaton, en el estado de Illinois. Él ha escrito vastamente en este tema y tiene materiales que pueden ser muy útiles.
But your question about nature, I mean, the most fundamental point that I'm trying to make here is if you don't believe that nature teaches a natural form of gender and sexuality and other kinds are deviations from it, then you won't even see the need to try to help or fix or heal, because this is just another expression of a minority but normal expression of sexual or gender behavior.
Así que si nosotros vemos esto solamente como una desviación, no vamos o una minoría, no vamos a buscar poder ayudar a estas personas. Así que hay que tratar de entenderlos de manera integral.
So I read Romans 1, which talks about the degradation of humanity so that they gave themselves up to homosexual behavior, men for men, women for women. For many years, I thought, oh, that makes it sound like homosexual practice is the worst of sin. It's like only when you've really hardened yourself against God and left him entirely. So homosexuals are like the worst, they're the reprobates.
Entonces, a veces cuando leemos a Romanos 1, y me pasó por muchos años, él dice que al leer a Romanos 1 entendemos que la homosexualidad, el acto homosexual sería lo peor, es la forma más degradada de pecado.
But I no longer believe that. I think that temptation is temptation for everyone, right? A homosexual is no more responsible for their same-sex attraction as I'm responsible for my opposite-sex attraction. It's just the way that I was made or produced, or but what is worse.
Entonces, tenemos que, ya yo no pienso así. La atracción al mismo sexo es tan mala como la atracción al otro sexo que yo puedo tener, o sea, una persona adúltera o lo que fuera, exactamente. Así que lo mismo, nosotros no podemos calificarla diferente.
But what is worse is when society and culture as a whole says, oh, there's no difference between those things, and we're not going to help our young people. Their moral framework is so far away from what God has revealed in nature that society no longer tries to help these young people, but instead celebrates them in their difficulties and challenges, right? That is a society that has moved far away from understanding God's message in nature, much less in Revelation.
Entonces, tenemos que el problema mayor es cuando la sociedad en general no reconoce estos problemas de las personas que tienen cualquier tipo de atracción, ya sea el mismo sexo o el sexo opuesto, lo que fuera, y lo normalizan. Entonces, perdemos la brújula moral, el marco de referencia para poder ayudar a esas personas, y en vez de ayudarlos, los celebramos, ya sea cualquier este tipo de conducta que es nociva para ellos.
And that's why a teaching of the natural law has to accompany the preaching of the third angel's message. Because if society doesn't know that it's wrong, it can't appreciate the third angel's message.
Por esa razón es importante enseñar ley natural con el mensaje del tercer ángel, porque si ellos no aprecian la ley natural, no van a apreciar el mensaje triangélico. Muy bien. We have only time for the questions that I had here in the pipeline. Tenemos tiempo solamente para lo que estaba aquí. Desgraciadamente, tenemos esta pregunta aquí. ¿Cómo trabajar con los casos alrededor del mundo en los cuales hay mutación cromosomática, que es la causa de la disforia y otras dificultades? I think you answered that one already with
Well, so to be clear, science has not found a gay gene.
Solamente para aclarar, la ciencia no ha encontrado el gen gay.
There is no gene that makes you automatically gay or transgender.
No hay ningún tipo de gen que te hace gay o transgénero.
We have identical twins. One is gay, one is not.
Tenemos gemelos idénticos y uno puede ser homosexual y otro no.
It seems clear that it's a combination of factors, including genetics.
Es una combinación de factores que puede ser genética y desarrollo temprano.
It may be beyond your conscious choice as a young person or as a teenager.
Y quizás va más allá de tu conciencia voluntaria como un niño o un adolescente.
But it is one that is triggered somewhere in the developmental process.
Pero que es detonado en algún momento dado durante el proceso de desarrollo. We have one more here, and you can translate in English. ¿Qué harían los líderes o la iglesia en caso de que haya un pastor con el mismo atracción al mismo género, o en el caso de la preparación de un estudiante de religión que tenga la inclinación al mismo género? ¿Cómo se le ayudaría a convencerlos de que Dios los hizo, como Dios les hizo y no para que Dios les hizo para gustarse del sexo opuesto?
Well, yeah, the question suffers a little bit from the assumption that the opposite of homosexuality is heterosexuality.
El problema de la pregunta es que asume que lo opuesto a homosexualidad es heterosexualidad.
And that conversion will take you from one to the other.
Y que la conversión te va a traer de un lado para el otro.
Whereas the church has come to acknowledge that the opposite of both homosexuality and heterosexuality is purity.
Porque la iglesia ha concluido que la necesidad de tanto de la homosexualidad como de la heterosexualidad es pureza.
And I should say promiscuous heterosexuality.
Sí,
is
cuando
purity.
está hablando acerca de la heterosexualidad promiscua.
We have said that it is not a sin to have homosexual attraction
Hemos hablado de que no es un pecado tener atracción homosexual,
as long as one is committed to the biblical teachings on life and behavior.
después que estemos comprometidos con los modelos bíblicos de vida y de conducta.
And so those are the fundamental questions. Do we allow single pastors at all?
Esa es la pregunta. ¿Permitimos tener pastores que sean solteros?
And if we have single heterosexual pastors, we're asking them to live lives of celibacy and faithfulness.
Si tenemos pastores que son solteros, ¿le estamos pidiendo una vida célibe?
Is that different for same-sex attracted pastors?
¿Será eso diferente para aquellos pastores que en el caso, porque el pastor que es soltero no significa que es homosexual, entonces, sino que le estamos pidiendo celibato? Y en el caso de aquellos que sean de atracción al mismo sexo, también le pedimos lo mismo.
And maybe it is, but you have to explain why.
Y si es así, hay que explicarlo. Good. Thank you. I'm going to wrap up here now.
Okay.
Muchas gracias al doctor Miller. Un aplauso para él, ¿verdad que sí? Miren, este es un recurso de lujo. No tuvimos tiempo para hablar, por ejemplo, de cómo los estudiantes que son de tendencia homosexual tienen mejores oportunidades y tienen una mejor experiencia estudiantil en universidades cristianas que mantienen su compromiso con la sexualidad. Aquí hay mucha tela para cortar. Sin embargo, yo quisiera terminar con una apelación. Yo fui director del programa de teología hace muchas lunas atrás y algunos de nuestros egresados, años después, han tenido desafíos con su sexualidad. Gracias al Señor, Dios me ha dado la oportunidad de mantener la comunicación con nuestros muchachos. Y la lucha es real. La lucha es real y dentro del contexto donde estamos aquí, puede ser que tú estés teniendo esa lucha interior y llores porque te sientes atraído a una persona del mismo sexo y crees que de alguna manera estás maldito por Dios o rechazado por Dios. Quiero que escuches claramente las palabras de Jesús. Yo tampoco te condeno. Él pasa su dedo en la arena y yo tengo que dejar mi piedra caer. Mis tendencias hacia el mismo sexo son tan problemáticas fuera del matrimonio, de solamente mirar a mi esposa, y que yo tengo que luchar diariamente. Sí, si creían que yo tenía la aureola y no tenía ese problema, esas son luchas que cada uno tiene que enfrentar. Ponte en las manos del Señor. No necesariamente es que te tienes que casar con una mujer o un hombre, si es caso de que seas una fémina. Se trata de poner pureza, como él enfatizó, y ponernos en las manos del Señor. Seamos empáticos. No burlemos. No hay espacio para chistes homofóbicos. No hay espacio para maltratar a alguien que usted ve que tal vez no es tan fuerte o tan burdo como usted o con la imagen que tiene de la masculinidad. Démosle oportunidad al Espíritu Santo y oremos con esa persona que tiene una lucha y que tal vez habló contigo y es tu amigo. Ora con esa persona. Mantén ese secreto delante del Señor. Que no se te ocurra a compartirlo con alguien. Ni en una comisión ministerial, ni en una experiencia de amigos que te voy a contar un caso para orar por esa persona. Recuérdate de ti mismo y tus necesidades delante del cielo. Si quieres en esta ocasión ponerte a las manos del Señor, como buen pastor, yo quiero hacer un llamado a que inclinemos nuestro rostro para orar y presentarnos delante del Señor. Padre amante y Padre bueno, gracias, Señor, por tu muerte y sacrificio en la cruz del Calvario. Gracias porque diste tu vida por mis pecados de orgullo, la crítica, Señor, la envidia y tantas otras cosas degradantes que yo hago igual que los fariseos son de menor impacto para mi ministerio o mi vida que la que tal vez esa jovencita o ese joven que está aquí luchando con su sexualidad. Gracias, Señor, por nos da la oportunidad de ministrar en iglesias en las cuales deben tener espacios amigables para que vengan personas con cualquier sea su pecado, Señor. Atracción al mismo sexo, atracción al sexo opuesto, mentirosos, criticones, orgullosos, ladrones. Para esos tú viniste a salvarlos, Señor. Bendícenos, nos ponemos en tus manos, reconociendo dónde estamos nosotros y dónde tú nos quieres llevar, porque no nos vas a dejar igual, Señor. Bendice a mis compañeras y compañeros aquí. Siempre nos ponemos en tus manos de amor. Y el Dr. Miller, en el nombre de Jesús. Amén.
Amen.
Dios les bendiga y gracias.
Hey, thank you. Yes, that's a good translation.